Welcome back. About a week ago, I posted a video on high dynamic range and exposure bracketing, and I got a lot of really good feedback on how useful and instructional that video was. So today, I thought I would post something a bit more fundamental that can be used whether you shoot on a smartphone, a DSLR, or an advanced mirrorless camera, and that is composition. Composition is the most important aspect of your photography. I like to say composition is king. You can have the perfect exposure settings. You can dial in your ISO, your aperture, your shutter speed, spot on, and have a lousy composition. Nothing is going to save that photo. On the other hand, if you have perfect composition, you follow the guidelines that we're going to talk about today, and even if your exposure settings are slightly off, that photo can be saved. Right? So perfect exposure does not save poor composition. Perfect composition always wins. So let's talk about composition today. When we talk about composition, there are some rules. Now, I know we don't want to get into rules. They tend to be boring. They tend to be, very specific on what you should and shouldn't do. Sure, but let's focus on two very basic things when it comes to composition, and that is subject and placement of the subject, right? As with any rule, rules are meant to be broken. I want to show you these two rules in practice. And as you get better at implementing them into your photos, feel free to break these rules. Feel free to, not follow them and see how your photos either improve or not. That's okay. It's more important that you know that these guides are there, these rules are there to help photos, pop and get better. And then you can always experiment with them. So let's get down to it. Subject and placement of subject. Take a look at this sunset photo. It's a beautiful photo of a lovely sunset, right? Or is it? I mean, there's some very interesting pattern of clouds in the sky. There's some very lovely colors associated with the sunset. But beyond that, what's really compelling about this? First of all, the ground is completely underexposed. It's very dark, but we know how to solve for that. We talked about high dynamic range and exposure bracketing last week, so we know how to solve for that technically. But aesthetically, what's here? I would argue that the problem with this photo is like any story, it doesn't have a subject. Any good movie, any good novel always has a protagonist, a subject that the viewer can fix their attention on and react to, whether positively or negatively, right? That's where the emotion in any kind of story, whether it's a book or a photo, it's tied to our emotional relationship with the subject. So I would argue that every good photo should have a subject. Notice I didn't say must have a subject. There are occasions where you may choose specifically not to have a subject. By and large, for the most part, I would say that every good photo should have a subject. And that's the problem with this photo. By contrast, take a look at this photo. It's very clear what the subject of this sunrise photo on the Connecticut shoreline is. It's the gazebo in front. Note that it's actually not the sun or anything in the sky for that matter. My own personal preference is I don't like to have objects in the sky, whether they're clouds, whether it's the sun or the moon, to be the subject of my photo. That's a personal preference. Obviously, if I'm taking a picture of the solar eclipse or a close-up zoom photo of the moon to show the craters and so on, yeah, the sun or the moon is going to be the subject of that photo. But for the most part, I prefer having a terrestrial object like this gazebo, or a barn, or a tree, or a person to be the subject of my photo. Back to our story analogy before, our novel analogy, I prefer that an object on the ground is my lead actor, my protagonist, and objects that are in the sky, like the sun or the moon or clouds, to be supporting actors that add color or a spotlight or some other emotional hue to the main character in my story. Now that we've talked about our lead actor, what do we do with that subject? Where do we place that subject in our story? So now we come to placement. Hint, it's not always the center of your photo that's the ideal location for your subject. Look at this photo of a sunrise in East Ham, Cape Cod. You'll notice that the subject is not in the center of the photo. The subject clearly here is this little rowboat. It is off to the side a little bit toward one of the corners of the photo. And there's a reason for that. And so the first rule or guide that we'll come to when we talk about placement is the notion of the rule of thirds. And the rule of thirds is simply this. If you take your screen, your viewfinder, your screen, your setting, your frame, and you divide it into a 3 by 3 grid. So think of a tic-tac-toe grid, a 3 by 3 grid. Your subject is ideally placed at the intersection of the vertical and horizontal lines on that grid. So there are four intersecting points. If you have a 3 by 3 grid, there will be four intersecting points as shown here. Your subject is ideally located on any one of those 4 points. So you want to set up your frame, your scene in such a way that your chosen subject then lies approximately where those lines cross in one of these 4 points. One piece of advice I will give you here is that it is often always better to have your subject pointing into the scene than out of the scene. You'll notice here that this boat is to the right of the frame and the bow of the boat is pointing toward the center. It's pointing in toward the center of the photo. That's more desirable. If this boat were turned such that it were pointing to the right of the photo, but I had located in the same spot on the right hand side of the photo, it would be pointing out of the photo, not as compelling because the viewer would then the viewer's eyes would then be drawn toward wherever that subject is pointing, which in that case would be out of the photo. And that would then lead to some dissonance because the viewer is then trying to figure out what is on the other side of this photo. I can't see because the photographer didn't take a picture of that. So ideally, you want the subject facing either straight on or into the photo because then the eyes of the viewer's eyes are drawn in toward wherever that subject is pointing or leaning, in which case, in this particular case, that would be into the center of the photo, and that's exactly what you want. Here's another example. Here in this photo, you have two co-subjects. You have a fisherman on his bass boat, and you have this red shack. So essentially, in this photo, you have two subjects. Notice that both of them are actually located approximately at the intersection of the horizontal and vertical lines, right? So you've got the shack, the house in the top left, and then you have the man and the boat on the bottom right. And so they're both located at these at the intersection of these nodes. Continuing our conversation on subject placement, in addition to the rule of thirds, the other way we can locate a subject favorably in our photo is through the use of leading lines. So if you take a look at this photo from Chilean Patagonia, the hero of this scene, the subject, the protagonist of this scene, is clearly the mountains, the Los Cuernos, the horns, the mountains that are in the background. That's the hero of this shot. And the headlights and taillights of the vehicles from the lower right corner up to the mountains leads the eyes up into the mountains. So here you have leading lines that are drawing the eyes into the hero of the shot. Now take a look at this photo from Jasper, Alberta in the Canadian Rockies. This is a photo of Pyramid Lake just before sunrise during blue hour. And so you've got this footbridge that takes us over Pyramid Lake onto Pyramid Island. So you can see how this footbridge forms a natural leading line from the mainland, drawing our eyes over Pyramid Lake onto Pyramid Island and the mountains beyond. So here's another example of using leading lines to highlight our subject, which would be the mountains and the trees in the background. So there you go. Those are the rules of composition. Very simple. Subject and placement of the subject. And within placement, you have the rule of thirds and leading lines. So now, whether you're using a smartphone or the most advanced mirrorless camera that's out there, these simple rules will make your next photos pop. Now, if you liked what you saw, please drop a comment down below, or even better, subscribe to my YouTube channel down below, as well as follow me on Instagram right here. And do let me know what else you'd like to learn more about next time, and we'll see you soon.